live. So let me just double check everything working. Oh shoot! Can someone speak real quick? Say hi.
Hello.
All right, we're good. Welcome. Welcome, guys. Today's our second forum. Today we have the Honorable David Friedman here to talk to us about anarcho-capitalism and to talk about his beliefs and just to answer some questions. We're very honored to be here today. We're my panelists. We have Benjamin Politics, Alex Popovic, and the Honorable Paul Kramer. So just to introduce David Friedman, you might know him as the son of Milton Friedman, but David Friedman is also a very well-known American economist, physicist, legal scholar, and an anarcho-capitalist theorist. He's known for his textbook writings on microeconomics and the libertarian theory of anarcho-capitalism, which is subject of his most popular book, Machinery of Freedom. Thank you, David, for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
Awesome.
Since I'm more or less locked into my house, it's the best way I know of interacting with people.
And so, we're going to just start and we're just going to go right off the bat. I just want to ask, first off, what would you say, um, you know, anarcho-capitalism, what would you, I guess, with that terminology, and would it just describe your belief system, and just, jump into that?
Sure. The idea of anarcho-capitalism is that on the whole, markets do things better than government, and that it would be possible to carry that principle all the way to replacing all useful things governments do by private voluntary arrangements by markets. Uh, that from, I guess, the obvious people, the people closest to me to disagree with would be people who call themselves minarchists, who are libertarians, but who think you ought to have a small government. And the two fundamental problems with their position, it is not true that there is nothing a government can do better, that there are a variety of economic arguments that show that a free market system will in some cases do less well than a perfectly wise benevolent despot could do. But we don't have any perfectly wise benevolent despots. So the issue is, given the institutions of politics, we don't have any way of limiting governments to only doing the small number of things they're better at, and they're likely to end up doing a whole bunch of things they're worse at. That a lot of people recognize that governments are mostly bad at doing hard things, that if the government is producing your food, you may have a famine or at least not very tasty food, that if the, I suppose, public school cafeterias would give you one example of that, that if the government is in charge of making cars, they are likely to be expensive and break down a lot. Making law is not an easy project. That as anybody who's actually studied law as a law student or in other contexts realizes, figuring out exactly what legal rules ought to be turns out to be much more complicated than it seems at first glance. And if governments are not competent to grow food or build cars, they probably aren't competent to make laws either. So then the question becomes, is there an alternative? And the argument that I've been making for a long time is that there is an alternative. It probably wouldn't work under all possible circumstances. I don't know of any system that will, but that under some plausible circumstances, you could have a functioning society where even what we think of as the most basic functions of government, which are basically making and enforcing the law, were done entirely privately. And in Machinery of Freedom, which was published now almost 50 years ago, I sketched out how that might work. My most recent book is a book called Legal Systems Very Different from Ours, which looks at a whole bunch of different legal systems and tries to understand them. And one of the things I concluded from the work that went into that book is that when I originally wrote The Machinery of Freedom, I was reinventing the wheel. That is to say, that I was sketching out a private law enforcement system in something like my society, a high division of labor, highly developed society, but that things of that sort had in fact existed in the past in a variety of different societies, had functioned, whether better or worse than alternatives is very hard to know, but then you had had societies in which for quite a long time, legal rules were in effect privately made and privately enforced. And I thought that was actually quite interesting. So one of the chapters in the new book is called Feud Law and tries to describe the logic of those systems, which, as I say, is a good deal simpler than the logic of the system I sketched, but is it's sort of like when you start an economics book, you sometimes have Robinson Crusoe on his island and try to analyze that. And in a sense, the Robinson Crusoe version of anarcho-capitalism is the kind of legal system that existed in pre-modern societies where law enforcement was essentially private. So I'll be glad to answer more detailed questions, but given that it took, about 60 or 70 pages of the book, plus maybe another 30 pages of the third edition to explain this, I don't think it's worth my trying to answer all questions in advance. So let me deal with the ones that occur to you.
Awesome stuff. Alex?
I was about to ask, what was your father's, Milton Friedman's, thoughts on you being an anarchist?
He thought that the institutions I described probably wouldn't work but might. And I thought they probably would work but might not. And that's not the kind of thing, given that we don't have any way of knowing for certain how untried institutions will work, that's not the sort of thing that one can reasonably expect to prove to each other. The fundamental difference wasn't that. The fundamental difference was that the project he was interested in was improving our society as it now exists. So he was willing to propose things that were sort of at the edge of what might happen, some of which, such as abolishing the draft, did happen, some of which, such as legalizing drugs, haven't yet, but we're gradually moving in that direction. And while I certainly agree that that's a valuable project and have spent some energy on it, the project that really intrigued me was trying to figure out how far you could carry these principles, whether there was any limit or whether you could, in effect, privatize everything. And that's just struck me as an interesting intellectual project. And I learned a good deal in the process of working on it.
I'll ask one more question, then I'll pass it off to someone else.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on like the Rockhardian justification for anarcho-capitalism based on like the natural property rights?
Yeah. I share some of those moral intuitions. It feels wrong to me to steal from people and such. On the other hand, actually getting from there to institutions is not all that easy if you really think about it. For example, am I entitled to steal from you if that's the only way of preventing Paul from stealing from Benjamin? If you think about the question of whether it's legitimate to have a tax-funded police force, which is essentially that problem. Am I entitled to steal from lots of people if I don't collect taxes from them, the Soviet Union will conquer us and make us much less free? So there are a bunch of questions which I don't think are really answered by saying it is always wrong to initiate coercion. Beyond that, as far as I can tell, neither Rothbard nor anybody else has ever really come up with a convincing demonstration of what moral beliefs are true. I happen to have moral beliefs not too far from Rothbard's, probably not identical, but I don't think I can prove them. So if somebody just says, I don't see what's wrong with this, it's perfectly legitimate to initiate coercion for a sufficiently good cause, all I could say is, well, that's your view. It may not be my view. So the strategy, in a sense, there's a sense in which it's a tactical or even a strategic problem. That my view is that I can't prove to people what's good. However, the variation in what people think is good is not all that large. That there are very few people who think it's a good thing for other people to starve to death, or a good thing for people to be ignorant and sick and so forth. I believe that the institutions I'm arguing for are not only somewhat better than the alternative, but a lot better. And if they're a lot better, then they are likely to be better in terms of the objectives that most people have, even though those objectives aren't all the same. So if you say, I really care about the poor, I would say, well, that's fine. I think the poor are important. You may have noticed that as the world has become more capitalist over about the last 30 years, the number of people in extreme poverty has dropped by a factor of 3. You may notice that if you compare capitalist and socialist societies that were closely related and adjacent, North Korea, South Korea, East Germany, West Germany, China, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, that the poor people ended up a whole lot better in the capitalist ones. So in that sense, I don't have to argue about whether the right objective is helping the poor or helping everybody or helping the rich or technological progress or other things people might value, because my best guess is that something close to my system will work for all of them. And my main reservation on that, which I've discussed at some length, especially in the third edition of my book, is there are circumstances in which my system would break down. And therefore, I cannot claim that for all societies in all possible situations. What I just said is true. But I can claim that I have good reason to think that if the system is workable, we can expect it to work better than any alternative, and that it is likely to be workable for many societies much of the time, as it were. I think that's the most that I'm willing to claim.
Bean,
Other questions?
Bean, your question?
Yeah. I was wondering what you thought about the critique from Robert Nozick about anarcho-capitalism eventually becoming a minimalist state or a minarchist state.
Yeah, I don't think it's true. I'm afraid I read that book a very long time ago. I can report that a very long time ago, I gave a talk on the book in which I offered my reasons for thinking he was mistaken at a Libertarian Party event at which Nozick was present. And Nozick was in the audience. And his response to the arguments I offered then was not to try to defend his position, but to offer what I think is a stronger argument for his position, namely that if anarcho-capitalism is a workable system, why don't we see it in modern societies? Probably he said, why don't we see it? And at the time, I would probably not have had good examples to say, well, we do see it just in very different societies. But in any case, and that's a legitimate argument, I don't think it's a conclusive argument, because after all, the set of institutions that are now the norm for developed countries were non-existent 200 years ago. I cannot think of any society, say in 1800, which had all races and both genders voting, women having essentially the same legal rights as men, government controlled by mass voter democracy, and government spending something between a quarter and half of the national income. I don't think any society with those characteristics had ever existed in 1800. And yet at this point, essentially all developed societies pretty much, there are probably a few exceptions, have those characteristics. So things do change. And part of what changes are things like technology, but part of it is also ideas. And I'm sort of in the idea business, that I like to say that democratic systems are like a old-fashioned microscope which has two controls, a coarse control and a fine control, if any of you have ever used one of those machines. The fine control for democratic systems is special interest politics, basically lobbying groups who can say to a legislator, if you pass this law to favor our group, here's what we'll do for you. The coarse control is mass voting based on free information. That is to say, the individual voter has no incentive to make sure that the information he votes on is correct, because the individual voter, except in a very small society, knows his vote is almost certainly not going to affect anything. So it makes sense for the individual voter to say, which politician makes me feel good, or which party should I adhere to if I want my friends to like me, because they all adhere to that party, things like that. So it's not that's why it's a coarse control mechanism. But it's a coarse control mechanism that's driven largely by free information. So if almost everybody believes that something is good, it then becomes politically profitable for a politician to at least say he's doing that something and maybe even to do it. And that means that one of the ways of trying to change things in such a system is to change the mix of free information, to arrange things somehow by putting ideas out, by expressing ideas in some persuasive form, so that more people believe things more nearly what you want them to believe. So I would have said that both my father and I and Rand were very successful in that project in very different ways. That Rand wrote novels that a very large number of people read. The novels were very persuasive. I don't think they were entirely right, although they were in part right. And my father wrote books and did a television series, which resulted in a whole bunch of people being exposed to his ideas, and some of them at least absorbed the ideas and agreed with them. And of course, lots of people on the other side. George Bernard Shaw was doing the same thing on the other side, and so are a fair variety of other people. Krugman tries to now. So anyway, so I guess that would be one way in which you try to change things. But no, as far as the problem is that it's been too long since that argument. And my impression is that there is no obvious reason why you would end up with a single firm. You could, but most industries do not have an equilibrium at a monopoly. That's a fairly unusual, though possible situation, because as a general rule, as the size of a firm increases, you can for a while you can take advantage of physical economies of scale. It's easier to make cars if once you've got the relevant machines, you're making lots of cars with the machines. But then you run into organizational diseconomies of scale, because the larger the firm is, the more levels there are between the president and the factory floor. Therefore, the more resources you've got to devote to passing information up and down and controlling the people at the bottom, and the less good job you do of it. So the result is that in most industries, you end up with an equilibrium with multiple firms. There are some industries, say restaurants, where you end up with a huge number of firms, and some where the economies of scale are large, like computer software, you end up with a much smaller number. It's not logically impossible that rights enforcement could be one of the natural monopolies, especially in a very small society, but I don't see any reason to expect it would be in a society the size of ours. And this is an issue I discussed in the first edition of Machinery, I should say. I go into it in more detail and raise some further problems that might lead to something like that happening in the third edition. Second edition has some additional stuff, but it's the third edition, which was after a long time, and I basically accumulated a bunch of stuff and then added 100 pages to the book. So if you read the book, try to make sure you get the third edition. Second edition you could read for free, by the way. It's on my webpage as a PDF. The third edition, I think, is about $5 as a Kindle. So I guess that would be. So no, Nozick was a neat person, and I've certainly learned things from him. I think his distinction between desert and entitlement is a very useful conceptual distinction if you're trying to understand our moral judgments, that we say, did he deserve that? Well, that's one reason why you might want him to get it, but is he entitled to it is in principle a separate reason. So the example, which I think I got from Nozick, though I'm not sure, is to imagine you have two people, each of whom justly owns whatever wealth he has, and they decide to bet $1 on a flip of a coin. And I bet it with Paul. Paul wins the flip. Does he deserve $1? He doesn't deserve $1. He didn't deserve to have the coin come up heads. Is he entitled to the $1? Yes, because he got it by a legitimate process. Namely, I agreed to bet and I lost. And that would be, I think, Nozick's very useful distinction, because if you think much more generally, when people say, is the distribution of income fair? Well, one is tempted to say that people get what they deserve, but of course they don't get what they deserve. Some of the things that affect what people get are ones we would think of as deserving. Some of them are pure luck. And some of them maybe are due to other causes. There may be even some people who get things because they're not very nice people. But most of us, I think, at some level have the intuition that if you got it by legitimate transactions, even if when Paul bet me on the flip of the coin, he happened to know that was not really a random coin, that coin was one that usually came up heads, well, I was fool enough to agree to the deal. He gets the $1. So in that case, Paul's not a very nice person. He's sort of been unfair to me, but nonetheless, it's his $1. So I think in that sense, it's a very useful distinction. And there are other things that Nozick has got a very interesting discussion of an experience machine, which we are getting closer to with virtual reality. And the question he's asking there is, what do we really value? So Nozick's experience machine, his hypothetical, is that there is somebody who can give you the illusion of a life. Think of this as a much better version of virtual reality than we now have. And somehow he knows the life you're going to live, and he offers you an illusion of a life just a little bit better, that you'll make a little bit more money, get one more promotion, your kids will be a little better behaved, not very much better, just a little, and you'll spend your whole life in his machine, never do anything, you have no children, in fact, you achieve nothing, but inside your head, you have exactly the same experiences. And the question is, do you accept the offer? And my answer is I don't. And that, it seems to me, is very useful, because it's a way of getting you the intuition that what you actually value is not just what happens inside your head, that you value things outside your head as well, even if you aren't going to know about them. So anyway, so I think highly of Nozick, and I think highly of Rand for that matter, but I disagree with both of them.
Yeah. Paul, do you have anything?
Sure. So I just have a little situation for you.
that I would want to ask you about. It's something that's brought up by a lot of people when you bring up anarcho-capitalism. So suppose that in a stateless society, people choose not to recognize private property and form other social agreements that constitute different property norms. Would you still support the abolition of state in that case? Or
Part of my argument in machinery is that what the laws are is not random. That just as when you have a capitalist system making cars, the question is, how do you feel if they make a car which can only go 5 miles an hour and uses 40 gallons a mile? I don't have to answer that question because the answer is they're not going to make that car. Or at least they are only going to make that car if the society is so primitive that a market system would also have made that car. Right? And similarly, in this case, I would say that I have a better reason to expect anarcho-capitalism to give strong private property rights than I do to have a political system to. Because if the arguments I offered in machinery are correct, and maybe they're not, the market for law, like ordinary markets, though for not exactly the same reasons, tends to give you what economists would call an economically efficient outcome. That if having a certain law is worth $10 to me and having the alternative is worth $5 to you, the market will eventually produce my law. If it's the other way around, it'll produce your law. So from that standpoint, the outcome you describe is only going to happen if the circumstances, either if my system doesn't work the way I think it would, which is always possible, or if the circumstances are such that that's the right rule. And of course, it sometimes is the right rule. I spend a good deal of a chapter in my book, Law's Order, discussing the trade-off between property and commons. Commons is anybody can take anything they want. Property is property. There are costs to both. The example I give is the English language. The English language is a commons. You don't have to pay anybody in order to use a word, even though somebody first used the word and invented it. You could imagine a world where every word is private property and you've got to license it before you can use it. That would not be a sensible arrangement. And that more generally, you've got a tension between costs of enforcing rights, costs of transacting over rights. On the other hand, the advantages that private property give you, which is an efficient allocation and an incentive to produce something. So if you tell me the outcome of anarcho-capitalism is that certain things are treated as commons, I then have to figure out whether I agree. It might well be that it would be, and that would be the right answer. For example, let's take the whole question of intellectual property. I think it's very much an open question whether patents and copyrights are a good thing. I've seen arguments on both sides. So I am not going to say if anarcho-capitalism doesn't produce intellectual property protection is a bad thing. It might because it was a good thing. On the other hand, let me try to give the flip side answer, which is maybe closer to what people want. Suppose I know that I'm in a society where private property is enforced, where the government doesn't misbehave badly. And suppose I somehow knew that due to some unexpected malfunctioning of my system, it would end up with no private property enforced. Then I wouldn't be in favor of making the change. It's just that I think that the odds are the other way, which is one reason why, without knowing how it'll turn out, I am in favor of making the change. Slowly, I should say. I'm a very conservative anarchist. I don't think you can build institutions instantly. That one of Rothbard's line was that if you had a button that would abolish the state, he'd wear out his thumb pushing the button. I wouldn't, because I think if you just abolish the state, you get another state very quickly, and it would probably be worse than the one we have. So
I do want to ask, you said earlier in this forum that Rand and your father were very influential when it comes to spreading their ideals, and I think a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago, actually, you had a discussion with Richard Wolff, and there's a whole movement around that. How do you feel that how do you think the Austrian school can expand its influence, promoting your ideals, and getting more people to
I'm not particularly a supporter of the Austrian school.
Oh, sorry. Excuse me.
The term Austrian school covers a fairly wide range.
Sorry, my fault.
There is an extreme version of the Austrian position which I am strongly opposed to because I think it's wrong, and which I think is roughly the position that Rothbard held. I don't really know Mises well enough to know if Rothbard is fairly representing Mises or not. And that's the idea that economics is pure a priori.
That's my fault. I'm sorry about that. I mean, just specifically anarcho-capitalism. Yeah, that's just a blunder. Yeah.
Capitalism has no particularly close connection with the Austrian Austrian.
Yeah, I'm definitely not.
Jesus, after all, was in favor of both state opera and the draft, and he was, I guess, one of the most famous Austrians. No, I think the way to, I don't think there's a answer independent of the person doing the spreading. That I think my father would have accomplished very little if he had tried to be a novelist, and I think Rand would have accomplished very little if he tried to be an economist. So one of the things that two things libertarians ought to appreciate. One of them is division of labor. Different people have different tasks. And the other is division of resources. You control your resources, I control mine, or the main resource is your own time and effort. If I convince you that the only thing worth doing is what I want to do, you probably won't do anything because it's not what you want to do. That if you look at political movements, whether libertarian or left-wing or whatever, they spend a lot of time fighting each other. And I think one of the reasons for that is this illusion that the movement has a pool of resources, the sum of what all the members have. And if you are wasting the movement's resources doing the wrong thing, if you're wasting the movement's resources being a professor when you ought to be running for office, or running for office when you ought to be a professor, then that's a terrible thing, and I've got to persuade you to stop doing it. And I think that's a mistake libertarians ought not to make, because there isn't a single right answer to that. There's at best a right answer for each person, and each person is only going to devote many resources, I think, if it's the answer that he likes. That's what he's good at and enjoys doing.
So, Professor Friedman, I follow-up question to that. Anarcho-capitalism itself is not that popular ideology amongst, professors. I live on Stanford campus, and there's, among economics professors, even just finding one that's libertarian is extremely rare. How, if we wanted to, right? At Benjamin Politics has a platform of about 200,000 people on TikTok. I have a platform. I'm part of a group account with around 1.1 million followers. And this organization itself, the Institute for Ethno Policy, also has a network of hundreds of thousands of website visitors every month. If we wanted to spread anarcho-capitalism, how would be the way to go about that? And then ultimately, how would you also achieve
that? That depends on your talents. Look, somebody, I think from Reason, recorded an interview with me in which I was trying to give a brief sketch of the sort of thing we've been talking about of anarcho-capitalism. Someone else who I'd never heard of took that video and added a bunch of cartoon drawings to it. The result, my impression is a lot of people have seen it. A lot of people have thought it was neat. I think it was neat. And I think the result of that was that the set of ideas I was pushing spread much farther and were more effective than if it was only by what I had done. So there isn't a general answer. That what you do is to apply your talents to, in some ways, making the argument more viral and more convincing. I like to say that one of the most effective things I've done, really for economics more than for libertarianism, though it's both, was provide an explanation of the principle of comparative advantage. That's a story that's easy to tell. This is my story about how we grow automobiles. That there are two technologies for making automobiles. We can build them in Detroit. We grow them in Iowa. How do you grow an automobile? You grow the raw material it's made out of, called wheat. You put it on a ship. The ship goes out into the Pacific and it comes back with Hondas on it. In effect, your wheat is a raw material you're using to make Hondas, and that makes the point that when you put up a tariff, you are not protecting American auto workers against Japanese auto workers. You're protecting American auto workers against the competition of American farmers. So it's a very simple story. It's almost correct. If I went into enough detail in an econ course, I'd point out that it's not quite 100% correct, but it's close, and it's easy to remember. So that's one answer, if you can think of things like that. But another answer is what the artist who did the cartoons did. Another answer is what Rand did, do fiction that's convincing. There isn't a single answer, I'm afraid. You have to find that answer for yourself.
I guess I'd want to ask one more question because I think we're very close to out of time. You said that you wrote Machinery of Freedom about 50 years ago. I mean, you're talking about people making viral videos of you getting doodling you. Are you more hopeful now of a future, possibly of any sort of anarcho-capitalism, or are you more?
I wouldn't say I'm either more or less. That if I look at what's happened over my lifetime, things are always moving in both directions.
Yeah.
That on the one hand, I wouldn't say quite as much now, but I certainly have said for quite a while that socialism had gotten destroyed. That when I was in college, there were lots of intelligent people who really thought the Soviet Union was doing it right. That the Soviet Union, according to Paul Samuelson's textbook, which is the most popular economics textbook, the Soviet Union was rapidly catching up on the US economically. And there were a lot of people who, in different forms, not all of them supporting the Soviet Union, thought that a system which government controlled the economy was a good thing. I think almost nobody who has actually thought about it currently believes that. And that's the result of the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed, that China abandoned socialism and prospered very strikingly as a result of abandoning socialism, that we've had 50 years of experience which suggests that system works very badly. There are still people who call themselves socialists. Socialism is a sort of a vague term which can mean a lot of different things to different people. But I think almost the only people who are socialists in the old sense are people who haven't really thought about the issue very much, of whom there are lots of people. On the other hand, environmentalism has to some extent filled the gap. That environmentalism has produced a new set of excuses for governments interfering with what people did. In one sense, that's progress, because the environmentalist argument is actually a better argument than the socialist argument. But it's not very much progress, because since it results in governments doing things and governments act in a way which is rarely sensible, as it were, it actually ends up creating an excuse for doing things most of which shouldn't be done. My favorite example of that is biofuels. That the idea of converting maize, what we call corn, into alcohol in order to reduce CO2 output was very popular for a little while. The eventual conclusion, as I understand it, of the environmentalists was that it doesn't work, that the amount of CO2 you produce in the process of producing the maize, which involves tractors and trucks and moving it around, is similar to the amount that it saves by not burning oil. Nonetheless, we still have a biofuels project which turns roughly half the US crop of maize into alcohol. The US is by a large margin the largest producer of maize in the world. I don't remember the exact number, but I think we're turning something like 20% of the world's supply of maize into alcohol. And maize is something that poor people eat in many parts of the world. So we've actually ended up with what I like to describe as America's contribution to world hunger. Why are we doing it? Because doing that pushes up the price of maize, and that means farmers will vote for you. And Al Gore actually admitted it, I think to his credit, that at the point when he was originally pushing biofuels, he was also trying to get nominated for president. And I think it was Iowa was the next primary coming up. And so he had a good political reason to be in favor of it and not to think too hard about the environmental argument for and against. So that'd be one example of the sense in which environmentalism is not an inherently bad idea, but in practice it ends up mostly having bad effects, I think.
Well, thank you so much, for taking our questions today. I'm sorry for my blunder, labeling you wrong. That's my bad. But
I think of myself as a Chicago school economist, not as an Austrian school economist.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that.
That question was that he was an American economist.
Yeah.
That it wasn't really useful talking in terms of the schools.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Well,
bye.
Thank you so much, and have a great one. Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.